What are the humanities? This is a short introduction to the humanities. Hi, it's Dr. Adrian Cook. I'm going to kind of walk you through this PowerPoint in lieu of being there to present it to you today. Um, and I know this is Fine Arts Appreciation. You are taking a humanities course. And the way that we do things in the humanities is very particular. It is a kind of academic discipline which we are going to discover. And of course, you'll note that first item of business here is the root word is human. So really this course is all about you. We are going to be looking at ourselves, our biases, our preferences, even our norms through the guise of the fine arts. But it's important to know what kind of class you are taking. So by the end of this, you should be able to define the humanities and to define it for yourself. Uh, to look at humanities in the context of academia, which is the culture of education, basically in school. We're also going to look at how this particular kind of education evolved and what its goals have been, because those goals have changed. And to, most importantly, probably for your success in the class, understand the skills that are associated with the humanities. Okay? So, first, you want to look at the fact that there are three different levels that we're examining here. On the very, very bottom there, many people, when I ask them to define humanities, they are thinking of humanity, which is simply the state of being human or humane. But what does that mean? Um, what might be fair or humane to one person is not to another. How do we act human? What is it we do that is particular? Uh, Instead of just what all the other animal species do, right? Uh, that's why the academic disciplines have been established. So the very top here, humanities, capital H, is a collection of these disciplines. And if you don't know what a discipline is, think classes. Like chemistry is a science class, but chemistry is the discipline. Biology is the discipline. Does that make sense? So the humanities are a collection of these disciplines. So for instance, if you are in an English class, that is a class that is listed under the humanities. Here I'm talking about the humanities division. So in our division here, we've got English and literature, we have philosophy, um, we have the arts, the fine and performing arts, and of course, the discipline of humanities. So that's where we are here, a separate discipline that focuses on human culture and critical thinking. So culture's a rather loaded word. Uh, think of it as ways of being, traditions, constructs we have, constructs like government, religion, festivals, that kind of thing. But critical thinking is the important key here. And we're going to look at how we think critically. The humanities is very particular in focusing on critical thought, particularly in looking at the big picture. So I love to look at humanities in this way. This is not mine. This is my colleague Kim Jackson came up with this. It's beautiful. Take the word, split it up. Human, the study of human culture. Right? And that's all human culture. What do we all have in common, regardless of what country you're from, what region you're from? And look at that as it relates to your personal perspective, right? So, for instance, it is very, very human to, I don't know, have heartache, right? How does that relate to your personal perspective? Have you just gone through a breakup? Have you lost somebody important to you? Have you had to move on from a group or a place that you really loved? Then you know heartache, and you know a particular kind of heartache, yours. Ties, looking at our connections to other human beings. So even though I didn't go through that terrible, messy breakup that you just did, I have had heartache in my life. And at that level, we can all connect. So humanities first has to take into account you. You should be at the center of this course. At every question you raise, at every analysis that you offer, truly consider what your perspective is, because you matter. But then to make a meaningful conversation with others, look at what you might have in common with somebody else, and it's often more than you think. All right, so here's our big money here. Why in the world are you in here? Chances are, if you're like everybody else who's ever taken this course, you're in here because you were told that you had to be in here. You have to take a fine arts credit. And what's interesting is you may or may not have asked, well, why do I have to take this? What's so important about this? Am I really going to use humanities in the same way that I would use math? Am I really going to say I'm a nurse? Am I really going to use humanities in the same way that I do anatomy and physiology? Well, no. The fact of the matter is that you're not. However, what you will use is critical thought. What if all of the signs, for instance, you have a patient come in and all of the signs point to strep throat, but the patient tests negative for strep throat twice? This actually just happened to my daughter. What do? We have to think critically about how to treat this thing to make that poor little 4.5-year-old feel better. And that's one of the things that the humanities offers. So what we're doing is we're looking at academia. We also call it the academy. This is education, but academia is the culture of education, right? So the fact that uh, I'm talking to you through this PowerPoint and you're probably taking notes, that's a cultural thing. It's a culture of learning. The professor professes, and you furiously write down notes and try to get the right answers. What's interesting is that sometimes there are right answers and sometimes there aren't. Let's look at these three columns, because pretty much any school you go to is going to be divided into these three major strains of education. We're probably most familiar with the right column here, hard and natural sciences. This is where we solve our problems. It's practical and product oriented. Some disciplines or classes that fit under this are, right, mathematics, a perfect language, which if you do the equation right, you come out with the right answer. Natural sciences. Once we study, say, bees long enough, we know how they behave, we know how they function, we know the difference between a worker and a queen. We understand their functions and they stick with those functions. We know how mitosis and meiosis happens. It always happens the same way, with very little deviation. And so what the hard and natural sciences focus on are quantitative data. Now, if you don't know what quantitative is, that is anything that can be measured. All right, you can assign a number to it. 7 out of 10 people, right, agree. This can of Monster that I'm now holding is 16 ounces until I drink it, right? It has a particular weight. It can all be measured, and it can all be measured uniformly, right? I can measure it, you can measure it. As long as we're using the same tools, we're going to come up with the same answer. Okay, that's quantitative data. We so need the hard and natural sciences. Why? Because they look for solutions, right? This is the solution based. How do we actually build a rocket that escapes Earth's gravity? But over here in the humanities, we ask the question, what's out there beyond our atmosphere, up there in the stars? Can we get out there? And we write stories about it. And we wonder what the benefits would be of space exploration so that eventually the scientists can make that happen for us, right? So our focus in the humanities is to generate ideas. That's why the humanities include things like philosophy, all of the arts, literature, right? We tell stories, which can be fictional, but that nonetheless generate ideas or thoughts. So the humanities is purely theoretical or process oriented. Um, do we want to know what justice is? Well, then we tell a story called Crime and Punishment. We philosophize on what universal justice actually means. We write a short story about it, sing a song, and work through that idea, knowing that we're not going to come to one solid, hardcore answer, right? But that we are just theorizing about the possibilities of how we achieve justice. The humanities focuses on qualitative data. Okay, so qualitative, if quantitative can be measured, qualitative wants to talk about the nature of something. Okay, what is justice like? Right? Not what is it, but what is it like? You cannot necessarily measure justice, right? If you could, we wouldn't have courts, really. You would do a crime, and we would look your punishment up on a rubric, and you would go and do that. But all things are not equal, right? So we listen to witnesses, don't we? We try to ascertain the circumstances under which the technically the crime was committed, right? And depending on those circumstances, which constitute qualitative data, the judge makes his or her decision. All right. So some examples of qualitative data are case studies, focus groups, right? Who would say, well, we like this television show. What do we like about it? What is it that it does, or the feeling that it produces in us that tells us that it's good? But there are multiple possibilities here, aren't they? And that's what this does, is it examines possibilities. In the middle of all this, you have the social sciences where theory and practice meet. This includes psychology, sociology, um, politics, right? Because what the social sciences does is establish patterns of human behavior and looks at how we best operate. This is how we come up with the idea of democracy, or particular religions, or a psychological diagnosis. We don't know to a certainty what causes that depression. However, people display certain behavioral patterns when they have it, so that we can go, well, it's most often that means you're depressed. right? So, what the social sciences do are look at big picture, look at patterns, and try to establish an understanding based on those patterns. But again, it's partially theoretical. The patterns, we might be able to quantify them somewhat, but mostly we're still looking at a bit of qualitative data. All right, but look at how each of these needs each other. Any problem that has a solution first has to start with us understanding that there is a problem that's over here in the humanities and saying, well, what about it? What is it like? What's that nature? Are others having this same problem or challenge? How are they dealing with it? How has it been dealt with in the past? All right. And then finally, if it's a chemical imbalance, maybe, then a pharmacist comes up with a pill. If we're talking about who do we want to be our president, people vote and they are counted. Those votes are counted or quantified. Okay. If we wonder how we are going to create more energy resources, we can imagine them over here in a science fiction novel, right? But eventually, the problem of obtaining this new kind of energy has to be solved over here. Fair enough. Interestingly, you can tell um, how a school is going to educate you by where they put each of the disciplines or classes, right, within this structure. So, for instance, at TCC, history is considered a social science. This means that there's equal parts theory and practice going on here. All right? It makes sense, doesn't it? For instance, we know that wars were fought from this date to this date. We know that a document was signed on this day by this person. Those are quantifiable things. Body counts in wars, for instance. However, why did those happen? Right? Why did it come to war? What made this country ally itself with another country? What made that person make that particular decision? Okay, so if you're putting those two factors together, right, the what and the why, then you're coming up with a social science. You're between theory and practice. All right. If you had the coach that taught history in high school, chances are it was taught as a hard science. Here are the dates. This happened, this happened, this happened. It's very practical. There's always a right answer, etc. And it makes sense. Why? I actually love sports. I'm not talking down about coaches at all. They have to be very smart individuals. What I'm suggesting is that it's a particular way of looking. If you are a coach, you deal primarily with kinesthesiology, all right, the science of movement. You're scientifically minded, and that's how you're going to teach the subject of history, because it does have that quantitative data that you can look to. However, um, where I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Dallas, history was in the humanities. So there was more of a focus on why did this happen? What were these people thinking? What was their culture like that they would have made such a decision? Right? What other factors might have gone into the start of this war other than just a single assassination or an exchange of words? Surely there have to be more possibilities. Let's explore those. That's the kind of history that we would do in the humanities. All right, so since we are not live, um, we cannot pair up. But what I do want you to do is take just a moment and go through this activity. All right, so um, listen to the instructions and then pause here. All right, um, you've been called for an interview with a job you really want. You're required to prepare a 15-minute presentation about how to improve the company. All right, this interview is tomorrow morning. Now, write out your plan of action for preparing for the interview. Okay, if you haven't yet, go ahead and pause here and take about 5 minutes and write down what would you do to prepare for this interview. It can be any company. So how many of you made researching the company one of your steps? If you simply said, okay, here's the company I'm going to interview for, and went straight to trying to create a presentation over a specific problem, then more than likely you are product oriented. This is what I'm going to do specifically. If you wanted to explore the company, its history, what its problems might be, if that was one of your steps, you're looking at process. All right. Most often we are trained to be product oriented, to look for that right answer. What the humanities does is look at the process. We even indulge in the process a little bit because we want to know all the angles. We want to explore. We excel at asking questions in the humanities. All right. Now, at the end of the day, you have to identify a problem, make a presentation, and go do your interview. Right? So you need both sides of it. Which side do you give preference to might tell you where you are on that educational continuum. You might be natural in the humanities if you really think about the process more than anything else. Okay, or if not, if you're primarily product oriented, what the humanities can do is help you to explore more options and actually create a better product in the end. But again, we need humanities, social sciences, and hard sciences. All right. So here's a neat little slide on the product versus the process. You can see that scientific expression or content, right, which is over here. We can tell that this is a giraffe, is product oriented, right? Focus on doing and practicing, all right? What specific information needs to be learned? That's a product orientation, all right? Or if you are motivated from without or externally, you have to fill this quota. You have to make a battery that has a particular charge. All right, that's extrinsic motivation. It's external and it's product oriented. If you're looking at the process, you're really looking at an artistic expression, the context. All right, I am doing art with paints and a paper plate. Right, I'm in a class. We're looking at how information is learned and are really motivated from within to explore, to ask questions, to know more, to think about what we know and what we don't know. Great example of quantitative versus qualitative data. All right, I have 13 trees that can be measured. I have blue, red, and yellow birds. I don't tell you how many I have of each, but simply that when I look at the big picture here, I can see all three of those colors. I know that there are birds. It's absolutely descriptive. I am telling you what. All right, but I'm telling you more the nature of the thing than the measure of the thing. Here are some examples, right, of the different kind of data. And by the way, even though we will focus on qualitative data here and gathering it, you will absolutely be asked to give structured data, to look at some statistics, to tell me what is objective, all right? But look at the difference between surveys and experiments, all right? Where you have to choose a particular answer, or in an experiment where you are eliminating all of the X factors, creating control groups, and testing one specific thing, as opposed to interviews, focus groups, and observations where you might get information that isn't expected. What you are going to explore here are all of the possibilities, all of the different factors that are interacting with one another. It is here, when we look at the extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, that you want to begin asking yourself, well, what do you want in your education, right? If you're doing this simply to get a job, right, there's a reward. Um, if you are stressing about that test so that you don't get any of the answers wrong, so that you get all of them right, you're actually looking at a punishment system, right? If you don't do this, this will happen. Extrinsic motivation is also the ideas of bonuses, hourly pay, um, do this, this, and this, or else, or else you could be fired. Um, if you do this, this, and this, here's what we give you: benefits and compensation. All right. And of course, again, we all need this, right? Competition drives us to perform better, perhaps, when we are not internally motivated to do so. And certainly, we all need to make that dollar, right? Every day we're hustling, every day we're hustling. So you have to earn a living. And you do need that compensation. You do have to ask what the bottom line is. If you pair that with intrinsic motivation, okay, now not only are you doing your job, but you're happy about it. All right. Autonomy. All right. How do I self start to explore, right, and to really become a master at what I do? Do we want to do our best so that we earn top dollar, or do we want to do our best because that's one of the conditions of being human, trying to be the best that you can be at something? Intrinsic motivation is also following a sense of purpose, right? Because at the end of the day, I also play in a band, and listen, I make maybe $500-600 a month doing that, right? I cannot support my family on that. All right. And it takes a lot of time. It really does. Between getting the songs together, even going to a gig and putting up and tearing down, um, I sacrifice some things. All right. I do that sacrifice because I know that it's a talent that I have, and it's a drive that I have, and it gives my life purpose to express in that particular way. All right, so I'm motivated to do it. I'm motivated to write better songs. I'm motivated to go out and play with everything I've got. Even when getting up out of my chair is the last thing I want to do, it gives me such purpose that I do it, and that's intrinsic motivation. Can we find it in ourselves to want to learn simply for the sake of learning? Uh, because that knowledge is going to give us mastery, not just of a subject, but you never know how the knowledge that you earn is going to show up. All right. Really, it comes down to the difference between being and doing, right? Because if you're motivated from within, intrinsic, that's a way of being, right? You can go out and do something and do it half-heartedly, right? But again, we need both. Um, But on the side of the humanities, creativity and innovation are the things that intrinsic motivation brings, right? Whereas extrinsic is about task completion, all right? And then, of course, the research that, you know, does suggest that developing this intrinsic motivation is not only enriching, but it actually helps us learn better and adapt better. And anybody who's been around long enough knows that in the 21st century, that's what we have to do. For instance, as a teacher of the humanities, when I took this class, it was all about classics of literature and art history, right? And now um, we're looking at a completely different world where you have access to all this art and all this music and all this expression. And we have things like social media, which are technically an art form, right? The way that we project ourselves into digital reality. Um, that we now have to look at that we never had to consider before, that political campaigns could be run on the internet in cyberspace. Um, we would be arguing about the taco trucks or what have you. I have had to adapt to a much different way of knowing the world and interfacing with the world. And I thank my humanities education for that. So the history piece of this is just really to give you an idea of how the humanities was regarded in education, and how we frame education on the whole, like what's happening historically in any given period, and what's happening with education. We're going to begin with the ancient Greeks, but please understand that Western civilization, and certainly civilization, does not begin here. Um, we begin because most of the background you'll get on Western Civ begins with the ancient Greeks, primarily because um, it's where we get a lot of our social structures from in this country ultimately, and because this was a time where a civilization was established such that there was an emphasis put on education and educational systems and the kinds of knowledge that we seek. But please keep in mind that all kinds of research is emerging that much more stable and advanced civilizations were actually in place in Africa even before the Greeks. I just wanted to contextualize that before we begin. So, the ancient Greeks. So, when we're looking at the social and political climate, we all have our rock stars. Think about who our rock stars and the really famous people are now. Who comes up for you? Just think in your mind. Did you get a Kardashian, a Ryan Gosling, a Beyonce, maybe even a Donald Trump? Now, how do those of fame differ from what we see in the Greeks here, who are the great thinkers and philosophers, are really given this sort of status? This is the age of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. You've probably heard of these thinkers, and this is where a lot of the thought, particularly in the humanities and literary criticism and um, philosophy proper, uh, really gets going. Again, the Greeks had established a society, and not just a society, a civilization, uh, to such an extent that you had the room, your basic necessities taken care of, and a social structure in place, so that you had a lot of art, particularly letters or, literature, stories, poetry, but also visual and performing arts. This is, of course, where drama as we know it really begins. Um, and yes, there was a great sense of national pride, if not some competition between the city states, and also the idea of democracy, uh, which we have revived sort of from the Greeks. Um, but what does democracy mean? It didn't look exactly like it looks today. And I'm not even sure that the United States is operating under true democracy. As a matter of fact, we know that it isn't in some regards. But this idea of free and open exchange of ideas are privileged. Exploration of those ideas is privileged. And not only that, but is seen as maybe the way to create a high functioning society. Right? Education at this time is holistic. Now, that's not to say that there are not prejudices, that education is not reserved for certain people. But what we do know is that this is a point of singularity where all of the knowledge that we are trying to gain as human beings is kind of under one banner. And we're recognizing that the body needs to be fed, that the spirit needs to be fed, and that the mind needs to be stimulated all at once. Um, that being educated is a responsibility. Um, and that there is this idea of theory and practice. This is where we get the term liberal arts. Liberal not meaning like politically liberal, as we've come to know it. It's not a politicized term at this point, but a means to liberate the mind. Um, and if you look at schools and you see that there is a school or a division of liberal arts or a liberal arts college, this is really being used interchangeably with the term humanities. All right, so the Greeks are about a holistic mind, body, spirit, um, thinking, exploring, and doing. Into the Romans. Basically, Rome. Uh, by the way, this is a very short history. All right, not all the ins and outs, but just to kind of put into perspective the idea of education. All right, so here comes Rome that conquers Greeks and culturally takes a lot of all actually of the Greek stories. They take the gods and rename them something else. They take the myths and rewrite them a little bit. It's very smart because in come the conquering Romans who take over this region, and you want to make a smooth transition, right, from one civilization to another, right, so that you don't have outright rebellion, so that you give people kind of a sense of comfort, right, even though they're being taken over. Um, but the transition is moving toward a warrior culture and a culture that has a very pronounced hierarchy. Now, this is highly functional and maintains order for quite some time. When you have a pronounced slave class, right, that's integrated in the social structure, you now have underlings, right, people with really no privilege, so that those of the lower class at least have somebody that's below them giving them a sense of importance, even though education is really given more to the upper class. So this whole thing is about order and structure. Artistically, what the Romans offer us is not a lot of original story, but absolutely brilliant and breathtaking architecture to place that within. Right, so one of their great contributions to Western civilization is architecture, not just buildings, but the layout of cities and a social structure. So, how does this impact education? If you look at a division of classes, then you have a division of who is educated and who is not. Okay. You also have architecture around the liberal arts. Instead of being as holistic, right, as the Greeks had it, you begin to create these divisions. And here we can see seven: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Um, Rhetoric is very, very important. If you're in the upper class, you're going to be um, educated in rhetoric, which is the art of making argument and convincing people, right? Grammar is the science of that. How do you write these things down, preserve them, establish rules um, to create a common language, right, that everybody can be taught, all right, so that they can be led? You do have humanities coming out of Cicero's Oratory Academy, right? So, if you're the privileged class, you're learning the skills of oratory, speech, logic, um, for everyone else, right? Including to a degree the upper class, the focus is more on athleticism. Think about how this might create just culturally the idea that we have today, right, of the nerds and the jocks, right? We have those stereotypes, and people think, oh, athletes, jocks, dumb. Well, not so. Think of the intelligence that it takes to be certainly a top grade quarterback. Um, it's not necessarily a true division, right? But you have this division, and the seed can be seen right here in the Roman Empire. Right. Also, you have the idea that by the end of this thing, by the end of the empire, um, you have brilliant architecture, but the entertainment devolves from tragedy and comedy to gladiatorial combat, reality TV. And what's interesting is that though they do not have access to education, one of the reasons that the empire finally falls is that you have more conquered people than conquering people, right? And so there's an outnumbering effect that happens. Um, but another thing that occurs is the rise and spread of Christianity. All right. Now, this is the medieval period. Look at this. We're talking about roughly 10 centuries, um, and a great suppression of information. When we move from a polytheistic view of the cosmos and of the world and into a monotheistic one, it is a game changer. Now, whatever your association with this faith, what happened in the wake of this is sort of the forcible conversion of the Western world. So it's a time of great war, the Crusades, in the name of religion. And so you've got massive migrations. Um, you have a church that is highly influential in political and government affairs. I mean, they become more or less the governing body and in charge of all the knowledge. And this shift to biblically based information in which science becomes taboo. Um, Interestingly enough, the spread of Christianity eliminates theater, Makes sense because, well, you can't say you're someone you're not. You can't lie. And Certainly many of the tragedies and even comedies came from a polytheistic or pagan society, right? So we have to do away with those, only to revive it later as a means of teaching people biblical concepts who could not read. Right, theater arises again in morality plays and mystery cycles. Um, but this is to say that the subject of art and learning is very biblically based and very narrow in its focus. Um, at the same time, this is the beginning of the university system. So your Harvard, your Yale, um, your William and Mary's. It's like Oxford. These grow up around a church-based society. And of course, most of the art is dealing with liturgical or religious matters. All right. But you are having people who are being highly educated in biblical scholarship and the interpretations of that into, you know, taking biblical concepts and transferring them to government, or even looking at what would be called science from that viewpoint. Okay. Then comes the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. The focus goes into humanism. There's only so far you can go, right, if you are singularly focused on giving biblical information. Um, One of the things that occurs is that, um, again, this information from the classical world, the Greeks and Romans, the Greco-Roman area, begins to reemerge. Again, as scholars dig deep into the vaults of human knowledge, and we begin to see these things as valuable. Um, Christianity wants to maintain its hold, and so we say, yes, you can look back at these myths and stories and from a pagan society and read them allegorically as Christian. All right, what are the biblical principles embedded in it if God is everywhere, right? And if that's so, then God must also have made science, and we can begin to reinvestigate those from the viewpoint that we're going to explore the creation, and one of those creations is us. If Christ appears in human form, then human beings must be very central. Another thing that happens, though, is the emergence of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution near the end of the Renaissance. This occurs because of increased contact actually with the Muslim world. All right, not from a religious perspective, but from a trade and commerce perspective. Currency is actually created because here come the ships from the Muslim world, and they have silks and precious metals and all these beautiful things, and they don't want anything that the Christian countries have to offer in trade. So we create currency as a way to exchange equitably. Now we have the rise also of industry, production, the assembly line, standardized production, um, and begin to really standardize our commerce and create this idea of capitalism as we know it. With all of these discoveries, of the ancient literature and beginning to reintegrate science and technologies such as the printing press, right? The holistic teaching methods of those Greeks reemerge. And there is a movement to the secular and worldly. um, of looking at geography, natural sciences, medicine, etc. All right, so here toward the end of the Renaissance, we actually see a shift toward scientific exploration, the scientific method, and new and emergent technologies. When you think about it, right, the printing press, the camera obscura, a lot of the seeds of the communication technology that we have now are being planted here. All right, as well as the focus on human beings as central and important. Which brings us to the modern era. Of course, our technologies continue to advance. We have great cataclysms in the world, like World War I, the Depression, World War II, which get us to a point where when World War II ends with a bang and we enter the atomic age, people begin to say, whoa, all of our knowledge has brought us to the point of making this super weapon. It's time to reevaluate things. Because we are reevaluating, we have major social movements beginning to arise. Here's the modern era right here. What do you notice? You have this overwhelming, this large billboard, the world's highest standard of living. And below it, people standing in a bread line. There's no way like the American way. With your happy family, somebody in a live class pointed out that even the dog is white, happy white family. Below, you have African American ladies and gentlemen standing in the bread line. So we have this idea, right, of how great America or whatever nation you're in is, and then we see the human problem right in front of that. Um, and so we begin dealing with um, the juxtaposition we see in our great ideas and philosophies and the way things actually are, and seek to correct those through social movement. So, in education, we begin having mandatory school for children. Now, interestingly enough, mandatory school for children in the United States begins not for the purpose of education, but in a way to keep children busy. Labor movements eliminate child labor, and so now we have to put them somewhere. Okay, so in education, the focus becomes on vocational education, right? Things that we need to do particular jobs once you get out of the system, all right? Interestingly enough, as technology increases, those jobs become obsolete more and more quickly, all right? So, are we doing a good job of education? In the school system, maybe not so much so. Maybe it's too product oriented, all right, rather than process. However, at the same time, because we're making all these examinations socially, the social sciences, particularly in higher learning, are not just emerging but exploding. In popularity, you have psychoanalysis from Freud. Freud says blame the mother, which ignites feminism, etc., etc. All right, so you have this great explosion of social sciences during this period. Where does this leave us now? Many scholars will say that postmodernism begins in the 60s or even in the 50s. But properly, we can really see postmodernism really hit its stride post 9/11. Look at this image. We're mixing sacred and secular icons. Those of you old enough will even recognize Mr. Spuds McKenzie down here in the bottom left-hand corner. Postmodernism is the idea that everything is branded, right, and comes with particular knowledge, that there is nothing new under the sun per se, but the only way that you make new information, create new ideas, is by mixing old ones together in a new way. Now, think about 9/11 and the war on terror. This is not a war against a country. The game has changed. There has to be a great amount of adaptation that happens here. 9/11, sure, many countries undergo attacks like this on a semi-regular basis. But it's the information, right? It's the meaning, the idea of America being this great, quote unquote, last superpower, being vulnerable, that becomes not just a local or national event, but a global event, right? When America is seen and sees itself as vulnerable to this sort of attack, it remixes the meaning of America. We also have the internet, digital technologies. This can all be done and manipulated digitally, right? The internet changes the way that we relate to the world, to each other. And if you look at anybody's Facebook feed, street art, what you are going to see is that there are no new building blocks, but plenty of new ideas because of the way we are rearranging them and remixing them. All right. You also have in this very young century um, a recession that scares us, and the historical election of Barack Obama. So again, we're reassigning different meanings. You also have, if I may say, hip hop as a major artistic player in this century, which is a very postmodern art, if you think about it. We will discuss that further when we meet again live. Think about the ways that the internet and digital technology has fundamentally changed the way that we experience the world. And if it's always been here for you, we're really going to talk about those generational differences, in being modern and being postmodern. As a Gen Xer, I've seen both, and it's been a very, very interesting transition. What this means for education is that because of the technology, there is this preoccupation with STEM fields, right? And yet at the same time, there is a focus on creativity, communication, and collaboration. Because what do we do with the technologies? Look at all the people, the emergence of YouTube, making films, collaborative music, the idea of merging a telephone, a computer, a camera, an music player, right? What's interesting is that there is an preoccupation with STEM fields, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Hard science fields in the academy. Outside of that, right? Out here, outside academia, I have seen more context, or how do these things relate to the world conversations, very academic conversations, for instance, on fan sites. If I go and read a fan forum on Breaking Bad or Star Trek, I get a very scholarly conversation with a lot of discussion of like, what does it mean, and what does it mean politically? And that's where we are learning that we have to begin to focus our education, or at least bring these things into balance, right? Because jobs that are hot right now will be obsolete in 10 years. Think about the decline in tellers, checkers, CPAs when TurboTax comes out. So we have to be able to adapt, to think critically, and to see ourselves in context. I love this graphic on the right. Right, right now, we're seeing a lot of funding cuts for the humanities. We're seeing the support being put into STEM fields. Um, we see that very often politics, particularly as it becomes um, entangled with religion, restrict humanities education. So, like, there's a big debate, particularly that humanities are needed to sustain democracy, um, and that we want to be intrinsically motivated. Against funding for humanities education is that, like, the results of it are not tangible, and that our technologies are making humanities obsolete. We're going to be dealing with this debate. However, of course, coming from my perspective, I'm going to say we need humanities education, but don't take my word for it. Um, Critical thinking, right, becomes the key. Because things are moving so quickly, because we are globalizing and are not just dealing with other cultures. If you're top tier business, Fortune 500 company doing a big trade, but seriously, we're interacting with each other all the time, and businesses are international. We have to have this education in the soft skills like cultural adaptation, um, like adaptation on the whole, thinking critically, solving a problem, coming up with the next thing, adapting to the next thing. Um, Not to mention preparing learners for college. Do you feel like you were prepared for college in high school? If you don't, it's probably because the focus was solely on product based learning, trade based learning, task based learning. My argument is not that we need solely the humanities. Quite the opposite. That we should have a balance, and that we need both sides of education to make the whole human being. So, I hope that this gives you an introduction to the humanities and sort of the perspective that we're working from in this class. And I can't wait to discuss this further and read your discussion boards. Let's see where we go from here. These are just some of the ways in which we hope to train you in the humanities to look at being able to solve problems no matter what context, culture, or situation you find yourself in. Because if we can master, right, the arts and letters, right, communication, empathy, and responsibility, which cannot be quantified, is not tangible, but is nonetheless absolutely required, particularly if democracy is to survive, to be empowered, right? To really look at evidence and analyze the situation, right? And to create new industries, You don't want to be the person working for somebody else. You want to innovate. You want to be the leader, right? And you want to be self-expressed and fulfilled while you do it. That's what we hope to empower you with. So, at the end of the day, I want you to try to be comfortable with the discomfort. Here's where we focus most of our education. Things that you know, right? I know this. I can pass the test. I know this. I know what the answer to number 5 is. Then there's the things that you know that you don't know, right? Well, that's what we go to school for, is to make the things that you don't know, the things that you know. Here's where we are. Getting to the thing, discovering what we don't know, that we don't even know that we don't know. It's a beautiful place of play and discovery and exploration. And I challenge you to explore, to explore, to explore. Ask questions. And then when you come up with an answer to that question, what you think is the answer to that question, ask another one, and another one, and another one. If you know what you don't know, that is just as valuable as having fixed knowledge of anything. And this is the place. Look at all this space for creativity, right? And you're in there. You find yourself in this space. You find who we are as human beings in this space. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So, we want you to look at humanities as the foundation of education because of its focus on critical thinking. If we didn't think critically, we'd never come up with that math formula. All right? It is an essential skill set. The postmodern era is also the creative age. The people with the new idea, the big idea, the forward-thinking idea, that idea no matter how small that nobody has thought of before, you are the masters of the new century. I will, of course, take your questions on the Ask the Professor forum, should you have any, or come to class prepared with them.